Offerings, Chapter 4. The wounds, once Ben had cleaned them, were slight, and although it was Marian who had shown the most concern, so much so that she could barely remember the kitchen afterwards, except that it was huge and bright and wonderfully old-fashioned, with everything double-sized. It was Ben who urged them out to the car, saying, "I think we'd better get the chief here home." "He'll be just fine, won't you, Sonny?" Miss Allardyce said. "Heck, any boy who can survive New York City." Marian put her arm around his shoulders and squeezed him protectively. He was no longer wearing his wounded expression. The patched knee and elbows were evidence enough. "He had just to get used to the country," she said to him. "Well, there'll be plenty of time for that," Miss Allardyce said. She reached into a box and pulled out a chocolate chip cookie. Ben was signaling Marian, indicating the door impatiently. "In a minute," she gestured. David tried to bite into the cookie, made a face, and then held it out to Marian distastefully. "It's like a rock," he said. "Probably stale," Miss Allardyce said with a sigh, "like everything else around here. Throw it out." Ben was holding the kitchen door open. "Let's go, Dave," he said, addressing Marian. When she passed him, she slapped his arm and whispered, "Why are you in such a hurry?" Miss Allardyce turned and pointed to a passageway beside the kitchen. "Servants' wings through there," she said. "Unused, needless to say, except for the old fool. Laundry room, pantry, sewing room, whatever else you can think of." She took Marian's arm and led her back to the entrance hall. Ben had slipped past them, joining David, who was limping toward the front door. "Once you're all set up, there will be no need to leave the place. Everything's here." They passed beside the staircase, which now had a small metal platform with a folding chair at its foot. Brother's inclinator. Brother himself was not in evidence. "Dining room," Miss Allardyce continued. "Library." Her thumb arched over her left shoulder, pointing backwards. "Greenhouse through there. A mess, I'm afraid." Marian remembered the photographs in the alcove, and of course there was no way she could mention them without admitting she had been snooping. Miss Allardyce led her directly ahead without stopping to open any of the closed doors. There were 6 rooms on the second floor. 2 with sitting rooms, beside our mother's suite in the west wing. The phrases came back to her, and the incantatory sound of their voices way at the end of the house, where you'll never see her, never ever know she's there. There were another 4 above that, if Miss Allardyce remembered correctly. Half the rooms I haven't been in for years, some of them never. Would you believe it? Heat was oil, tenants' expenses, not that they needed it. There were individual heaters in the bedroom for the cool spells. She rattled off more details. Linens, dishes, pots, all provided. The old fool will show them the pool house and the gardening shed when they took possession. Oops, sorry, if. Ben and David were still walking ahead, Ben impatiently, Marian thought, and rudely so, which surprised her, not bothering to look back or show even token interest in Miss Allardyce's booming inventory. "Did you hear all that, Ben?" Marian called. "I heard," he said from the porch, and bent to check the bandage on David's knee. Marian shrugged an apology to Miss Allardyce, who dismissed him with a reassuring wave. "He just wants to seem too interested," she said. "Maybe Brother spotted it." "Let me work on it," Marian said. "Can we call you tomorrow?" "Noon, the latest." She stopped her just inside the front door. "We hate to lose you, but like I said, there are others." "Oh, I don't think you'll lose us," Marian assured her. "Not if I have anything to say about it." She smiled, and Miss Allardyce smiled back. "I don't think we're going to lose you either." She was giving Marian that close, discomforting look again. "You won't be sorry, Marian," she said. believe me. It was her other sound, the voice underneath, and Marian heard rooms and rooms again, and basement and sub-basements, the words rolling inside her with the cadence of waves. Ben's voice came at them from the edge of the porch. "It's a beautiful house, Miss Allardyce," he said, and the waves stopped inside her. He took a step down, supporting David, who laughed when the wood creaked under them. "Thanks very much." It was a politic enough, and as far as he was concerned, final enough as well. She had looked back at the house just once, and they drove through the field, then sat back and stared ahead silently. Ben was watching the twists in the road, glancing at her quickly once or twice. He had seen the same expression often enough in the past to realize that she was already rearranging the furniture. Casters rolled in the silence, and the smell of lemon oil blew in with the hot rush of air. The car tunneled through the woods, stopped at the stone pillars, and turned right, onto the dirt road. Ben took his foot off the gas, said, "Whew," and shook his head. "So that's what they mean by the funny farm." Marian held the stairs straight ahead, and now that he noticed, somewhat stony. He shrugged, looked furtively left and right, and stepped on the gas pedal hard, spinning the rear wheels and raising a cloud of yellow dust. He released his foot immediately and waited for Marian's reaction. "You know I don't like games when you're driving," she said icily. "Sorry," he replied. The stone wall disappeared behind the foliage. She drew a deep breath to power the words and finally announced, "You were impossibly rude." "Was I?" he said innocently. "I wasn't aware of it. You could have shown some interest. It was downright embarrassing." "Honey, you showed enough for both of us," he said, patiently panting her knee for emphasis. "I heard the pitch. I just wanted to get out of there." "You made that clear enough," she said, shifting in the seat and loosening a bit. "Do you mind telling me why?" He half turned in her direction, then brought his eyes back to the road. "Oh, come on, babe. You gotta be kidding. Someone ought to go in there with a large butterfly net." "Oh, because they're a little eccentric?" "Eccentric," he laughed. "Honey, that kind of eccentric is out and out certifiable." "Oh, they got carried away, that's all." "Not yet they didn't, but they will. They will." "Whatever they are," she said while he chuckled, "it has nothing to do with the house. It's perfect. It's an absolutely ideal." He waited for the smile to disappear. "You're sure about that?" he said. "Oh, of course I'm sure." She drew her leg up under her and faced him. "Ben, I honestly don't see what there is to think about. It's infinitely more than we were looking for." "I wasn't looking for anything, Marian. I'm just along for the ride, remember?" "For once," she said a little angrily, "be serious." "All right," he said, "serious." He looked at her long enough for her to bring her hand up, and the wheel, which was vibrating with the ripples and potholes in the road. "I don't like the house." He said it simply and firmly, and she knew the tone very seriously. It hardly came as a surprise to her. His reaction to the house had been as obvious as her own. She forced a laugh anyway. "Don't like it?" she said in disbelief. "For God's sakes, why?" David was pushing a half-unwrapped sandwich over the seat and under her nose. "What's this stuff?" he asked. "Chicken salad," she said quickly, anxious to pursue Ben's absurd statement. "We got anything else?" "Shrimp salad." She brushed the sandwich away as David made a retching sound. He sat back and Marian draped her hand over the seat and touched his knee gently. She kept her eyes on Ben. "There's something weird about the place," he said finally. "Christ, Marian, you must have felt it yourself." "All right, they're weird, they're crazy," she said for the last time. "But honey, we're renting the house, not Miss Allardyce and her brother." "The house is what I'm talking about, the whole deal. There's something suspicious about it." "I call it luck." "Luck? Huh?" "Luck. I mean, just to have it fall into our laps like that." "Marian," he cut in, "you don't rent an estate like that for $900. "Well, why not? Maybe they don't need the money." Maybe it's more important to have someone look after the place. Just be there. That's worth some concession, isn't it? Especially if they happen to be the right people. Meaning us? Us. Is that so hard to accept? All right, maybe not. What's a damn sight harder to accept, even from two weirdos like that, is the rest of the deal, the old lady. You don't leave a 90-year-old woman, 85, 185, what's the fucking difference? You don't leave an old lady with total strangers, and I don't care how right they happen to be. It's A, presumptuous, and B, irresponsible. Christ, do you really want that kind of burden? For that house? Yes, if those are the terms. Will you try to see something besides the house, like who feeds her? Oh, honey, a tray 3 times a day, that's all. Who cleans up after her? What if something should happen? You heard what they say, we won't even know she's there. Whatever those nuts may think, an old woman needs some kind of attention. Does Aunt Elizabeth? Well, what does that have got to do with it? Does Aunt Elizabeth, she insisted. Aunt Elizabeth is different. How do you know that? I know Aunt Elizabeth, which is more than you can say for Mama Allardyce. Don't be so flippant, she said, and when he looked to see whether she had meant it seriously, she pointed left and said, "Turn here." They had reached the blacktop perpendicular to the dirt road. He made the turn and caught David in the rearview mirror. His upper lip was smeared with mayonnaise. "How's it going, Dave?" he said. Dave said, "Fine," and Marion turned and said, "You liked the house, didn't you, sweetheart?" It was okay." Marion wiped his lips with the tissue. "And you learned to be a little bit more careful, wouldn't you? We're gonna buy it? We'd be crazy not to, don't you think?" She was brushing his hair back from his forehead, which was damp and a little red from the sun. "I think we should look at some of the others," Ben said. Her hand rested on David's head for a second. He moved away as she let it fall. "Why?" she said wearily. "If you don't want that one, you obviously don't want any of them. Like you said, you're just out for the ride." "If we find something, we'll take it," he said, and for the first time he really meant it, even if he had come out to pacify her. He gave her knee a reassuring squeeze, and when she remained silent, obviously brooding, he squeezed harder and repeated, Just okay, babe, cross my heart." He made the gesture, and she faced front, her eyes passing somewhere under his shoulder. "As far as I'm concerned, we found it," she said sullenly. "I don't want to see anything else." "Come on," he said, nodding at her bag. "Dig in and pull out the list." "I don't want to see anything else," Marion repeated with a vehemence he had seldom heard in her before. When 10 minutes later they passed through the small cluster of buildings again, there was a car parked outside the post office this time, and some activity behind the window of the general store. They were both still silent. David leaned between them and asked, "When's the picnic?" "Some other time, Chief," Ben said. Marion continued to stare ahead, calling out monosyllabic directions until they reached Riverhead and the expressway, which eventually became jammed with traffic in both directions. At one point, she reached into the picnic hamper for a shrimp salad sandwich. She unwrapped it for Ben and held a thermos cup of coffee for him while he inched past construction crews and overheated cars, and near the Nassau-Queens line, a wicked 3-car smash-up. He brought up the house once more, apologetically, and was about to catalog his objections again, but she cut him off with a resigned, "It's forgotten." Still, she refused to look at any other houses, and when he said, "Maybe next week, then," she shrugged and replied, "Maybe," with little interest. It was after 2 when he pulled into the bus stop in front of their building. He kept the motor running and let Marion out, and David, who was going upstairs for their baseball gloves and a softball. "Hun," he called out to her, leaning across the seat. "You're all right, aren't you?" She looked up at the building, counted the 8 floors, and added 2 for an uneven, therapeutic 10, and said, "Of course I'm all right." He watched her walk away without turning. "We'll be back by 4, okay?" "Whenever," she said. She dodged the kids, the tricycles, the jump ropes, and the ball whacking against the side of the building, edged past the knot of women at the entrance, and disappeared inside. Ben sat up and leaned against the wheel. "Forgotten my ass," he said to himself. It was the treatment, of course, laid on a little heavier than usual, but following the basic paradigm, distance, silence, a cold plate for dinner. He had pointed it out to her after dinner, misjudging her mood. She flared up and locked herself in the bathroom for 10 minutes. He might have given it and maybe even given in at that point and called the Allardyces despite his feelings about the house. Hell, if it was that important to her, but his own instincts were still stronger than her stubborn petulance. No doubt she was feeling exactly the same way, and for all the times he had given in, the evidence was ranged around the apartment. She could give in this once. She was in bed before him, and when he leaned over to kiss her, to make one more attempt, her breathing suddenly became heavier and more regular. She was making herself sick. He had told her earlier, all over a lousy house for the summer, and yes, she agreed resentfully. She was making herself sick. She wanted in that much. Oh my God, it was ridiculous. A house after all. Ben lay back, his hand beside his head, and distracted himself with the sounds from the neighboring building. There was a party somewhere above the courtyard. The decibel count would rise until around 2, when the music would stop and there'd be 10 minutes or so of drunken batter below the windows. The late movies then, and then the accelerated hum of air conditioners until the string of bars let out on Northern Boulevard roared with the sound of souped-up cars and an occasional police siren. Saturday nights, a whole summer of them. A whole summer of what? Another course, another fumbling attempt at his master's, scrounge around for a job teaching summer school. His will was weakening. He recognized the signs. The shade moved, and he waited for the breeze to pass over him. When it did, he said Marian quietly. The heavy breathing lost a beat. Does it really mean that much to you? He said. Her voice, when it finally came, was very much awake. You know it does. She shifted a little away from him. I'll survive, she said. The question is, will I? He put his hand on her shoulder and let it slide down to her hip. It's hot, she said. Move to your own side. He didn't, and she made no attempt to move away from him. Do you want to call them? He asked. She gave a long sigh, and her breath caught just a little beyond control. At this point, Ben, I don't care much what you do. Just before noon Sunday morning, the phone rang in the hall. Miss Allardyce reached it on the second ring, and then let it ring 3 more times until Brother came in from the alcove and Walker was from the kitchen. They heard her say, "Oh, marvelous, just marvelous, and Brother will be thrilled," which was all they needed to hear. The 1st of July would be fine, and of course they'd all be there and show them the house and everything they needed to know. When she hung up, she was smiling. "Our mother," Brother asked, holding out his hand to Miss Allardyce, "is going to be just fine, Brother." She patted his hand reassuringly, and Walker, without waiting to be barked at, went out to the car to prepare it for its biennial trip.